Imagine you've poured hours into designing a beautiful sweater pattern only to realise that when you knit it up, the stitch that you've chosen is upside down because you didn't consider the construction of the sweater when you selected your stitch pattern. Or perhaps imagine knitting up this beautiful sample, and then when you're ready to start grading it into other sizes, you realise that the scale of the motif that you chose for your sample is too large and it doesn't grade very easily into the other sizes. Frustrating, right? Well, my name is Claire Mountain Manapon. I'm from Sister Mountain, and in today's video I'm going to teach you everything that you need to consider when selecting a new stitch or motif for your knitting pattern. Let's get started. Now, as I mentioned in the introduction, my name is Claire Mountain Manapon. I am the designer and teacher behind Sister Mountain, and you may also know me from my online course, the Sweater Design School, where I teach knitters how to design sweaters from the top down. I live here in very grey London, England, and I live with my husband Ulysses and our little toddler Nico. In this video, I'm going to be talking about all of the things that you need to consider when designing a new knitting pattern and applying a stitch or motif to it, because it's not just as simple as choosing, a pullover style or a hat style or a sock and then just selecting a stitch and just plonking that stitch on there. There are multiple things to consider in order to make that pattern work successfully, and I'm going to be showing you those in this video. Now, the first thing you need to consider, as I touched on earlier, is the direction of your knitting. Now, when you're designing a piece, you need to know what that final project will be knitted, like what direction it will be knitted in. So if you're designing a pullover or a cardigan, are you knitting it from the bottom up or are you knitting it from the top down? Likewise with socks, is it a toe up sock or a cuff down sock? From hats, though I know most of the time people are designing hats from the bottom up, but sometimes people are designing from the top down, and these are all things that you need to consider, because if you are knitting a stitch and you've knitted your swatch from the bottom up, but then you start constructing your sweater or your socks or hat from the top down, that stitch is going to be upside down. And so when you're selecting a stitch or designing a stitch, make sure that you consider the direction that you're going to be knitting it in so that your stitch doesn't end up upside down. Now, some stitches are very versatile and they will look the same whether they're knitted from the top down or the bottom up, and you really don't need to worry too much about how that looks. But for others, it will be very clear that it is upside down. Maybe it's a kind of pictorial motif, or even it's maybe not obvious to others that it's upside down, but it's just not the way that you wanted the stitch to look. Think about that from the very beginning, and then you won't be disappointed when you finally start knitting it up. Now, I'm going to get into my next point, which is all about the scale of your stitch or motif. But before we do that, I would like to ask you a question for you to share your answer in the comments. Do you prefer knitting from the top down or from the bottom up? Or does it depend on the project? Let me know in the comments section. I would love to hear from you. Another really important thing to consider is the scale of your stitch or motif. Now, the reason I say this is purely because of grading. When you're grading a pattern, you are working with a size range, and there will be increments between those sizes in your size range. So if you're working with maybe a hat or a sweater, there will be, a specific kind of increment between each of those sizes, which might be typically around the 5 centimeters, 2 inches mark. Now, if you're working with an all over stitch repeat that is bigger, much bigger than 5 centimeters or 2 inches, you can see how that could lead you into problems. What usually happens is that you end up really limiting the size range in your pattern, because you cannot just physically, you cannot fit those pattern repeats into the number of sizes that you want to. It really limits the number of sizes that you can offer in your pattern, because those, you just have too bigger gaps between the sizes essentially. So if you are going for size inclusivity with your designs, which you absolutely should, then this is gonna, limit you in that regard. If you're designing something in a wide range of sizes and you want it to have an all over stitch repeat, you're better off choosing a repeat that is smaller so that you can design in the number of sizes that you set out to, and you're not limited by your pattern repeat. Now that doesn't mean that you can't work with larger, scaled stitches or motifs. That's really not what I'm saying here. It's just more about considering your placement of those stitches or motifs. Larger stitches or motifs are much better to work with in terms of grading if you use them in a panel as opposed to an all over stitch repeat. It just means that you can choose the placement of it and maybe have some filler stitches around it, and you're not limiting the circumference of the body by your pattern repeat. Now what's nice about using it in terms of a panel placement is that you can also go about grading those panels if you wish, and I can talk about this in another video if you're interested in it, but essentially what you can do is make some minor changes to that panel to adjust the scale of that panel across different sizes in your range, maybe offering a couple or maybe 3 different kind of panel options so that the overall scale of that panel works really well with the overall size of the sweater. So you're really keeping it very proportional to the overall size of the sweater. And like I said, let me know if that's something that you'd be interested in me talking about a bit more in a future video. The final thing that I want you to consider is the kind of purpose of this design. What is the project's purpose? So if you're designing a hat, the functional kind of things you need to consider with a hat is that it needs to be stretchy enough to stay on the head without slipping off. If you are designing a pair of socks, again, it needs to be stretchy and kind of snug and stay on the foot. And if you're designing a sweater, then you need to think about just kind of comfort and practicalities of what a sweater needs. So for example, going back to the socks, a pair of brioche socks, if you're wanting them to be, everyday socks, is not the most practical because brioche is so stretchy, they're going to go out of shape really quickly, they're going to be slipping and sliding around on your feet. It's not the best stitch for your intended project. Likewise with a hat, if you want to design a hat and you choose a stitch like a linen stitch, for example, which is really, really firm and has very little stretch, it's just not going to work well for a hat. And the same can be said for like a long, say you're doing kind of a really long, oversized, kind of slouchy sweater dress, and you design it in a stitch that eats loads and loads of yarn, such as like a fisherman's rib. It's just going to get really stretched and out of shape really quickly, and it's just not the most practical stitch for the intended purpose. I really encourage you to consider all of these aspects when choosing a stitch or a motif for your design. So consider the direction that you're going to be knitting the final piece in, consider the scale of your stitch or motif, and also consider the actual purpose of the item that you're designing it for. If you consider those 3 things, you are going to be well on your way to selecting a stitch that is perfect for its intended design. Now, if you enjoyed this video, there are lots more where this came from. I'm going to be doing tons more content all about knitting pattern design, so make sure that you subscribe to my channel and you will get notified whenever a new video is uploaded. And if you're interested in learning more about what I teach inside of Sweater Design School, I've shared the link to the introductory video. It's completely free, where you can get a taster of what I teach inside of the course. And I cover everything about, designing multi-size sweater patterns without fearing that your ideas are not original enough. So if that sounds like something that you would be interested in, then you can click on the link to watch that video in the description box. Thank you so much for watching. It is my pleasure to teach you, and I hope that you've gotten something out of this video. I'll be back next week with more content about knitting pattern design. Bye. Bye.